The following program is a work of fiction. The station, broadcast, and events depicted are for narrative and entertainment purposes only.
This is WLLR-AM 9913, Civil Defense Emergency Broadcast Network, Tri-County Region. My name is Daniel Marsh, Civil Defense Coordinator, 11 years on this console. The time is 8:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I am initiating a live Federal Archive transmission under emergency documentation protocols. I need to be clear about what this broadcast is and what it isn't. This is not a weather advisory. This is not a traffic alert. This is not a standard emergency notification. This is a record. What I'm about to describe began as a routine evening at Regional Airport Authority Field. Routine in every measurable sense. Weather clear, visibility unrestricted, light crosswind from the northwest. Normal Tuesday operations. Commuters, business travelers, families. The ordinary machinery of people moving from one place to another. I've been doing this job for 11 years. I've managed chemical spill evacuations, coordinated responses to 2 major highway pileups, and held this console together through a partial dam breach that kept me awake for 36 consecutive hours. I know what normal looks like. I know what abnormal sounds like the moment it starts. What I'm dealing with tonight doesn't sound like anything I've heard before. At 6:23 p.m., Trans-Continental Flight 447 from Chicago O'Hare landed safely at Regional Airport. 138 passengers. Routine approach, runway 27 left, no complications. The aircraft taxied to Gate 12, connected to ground power, and was secured for overnight maintenance. Completely unremarkable. That's the word the tower supervisor used. Completely unremarkable. At 7:41 p.m., the same aircraft appeared on approach radar again. Same tail number, same flight designation, same reported passenger manifest, same captain, same origin city. The first aircraft is still at Gate 12. I can see it on the tarmac cameras right now. Dark, silent, connected to the terminal. The second aircraft is on taxiway Alpha, surrounded by emergency vehicles, engines still running. Both are real. Both are documented. Both are impossible. I've been awake for 14 hours, and I'm going to be awake for many more. Stay on this frequency. What you're about to hear is the unfiltered account of an event our systems were never designed to process. The time is 8:51 p.m. Both aircraft are still on the ground. Let me walk you through the first landing precisely, because the details matter now in ways nobody anticipated when they were happening. Trans-Continental 447 established contact with Regional Tower at 6:18 p.m. Captain Sarah Chin, 18 years of commercial flight experience, reported normal approach conditions with light crosswinds. The aircraft was carrying 138 passengers and a crew of 6. I've listened to the tower audio 3 times tonight. Chen's voice is textbook professional, calm, measured, completely routine. Regional Tower, Transcon 447 with you at 8,000, information Charlie. Transcon 447, Regional Tower, radar contact. Descend and maintain 4,000. Runway 27 left, wind 280 at 7 knots. Standard phraseology. The kind of radio traffic that repeats thousands of times daily across the national airspace. Nobody flags it. Nobody should flag it. The aircraft touched down at 6:23:17 p.m. Our emergency systems log every commercial arrival automatically, so I have the exact timestamp. The landing was textbook, centerline touchdown, clean rollout, no emergency equipment deployed. Ground control directed 447 to Gate 12. Passengers deplaned through the jetway. Baggage went to Carousel C. By 6:45 p.m., the last passenger had cleared the arrival area, and the aircraft was powered down for its maintenance check. Tower Supervisor Roberts signed off on the arrival as completely unremarkable. I want you to understand what that means coming from Roberts. 23 years in that tower, he's talked pilots through engine failures, gear-up approaches, severe weather diversions. He's the kind of person who doesn't rattle. When Roberts calls something unremarkable, it means it fell well within the outer boundary of normal operations. The passengers from that first flight went to hotels, rental counters, passenger pickup. Some are probably already home, telling their families about a smooth flight from Chicago, pouring a glass of wine, completely unaware of what happened after they left. At 7:38 p.m., Regional Tower picked up a new radar contact, descending through 12,000 feet on the exact same approach path. When they queried the aircraft, the transponder response came back as Trans-Continental Flight 447. Same flight number, same aircraft registration, same reported origin and passenger count. Roberts looked at his arrival log showing 447 safely on the ground at Gate 12, then looked at his radar screen showing 447 3 minutes from touchdown on runway 27 left. He called us at 7:44 p.m. I picked up the phone expecting a transponder malfunction or a data processing error. I was not prepared for Roberts's voice when he said, "Marsh, I have an aircraft on final approach squawking the registration of a plane that's currently sitting at Gate 12. Same call sign, same tail number, same crew voice. I need you to tell me what my protocol is." Roberts is not a man who panics. I want to establish that clearly before I tell you what happened next. His voice was controlled, deliberate. The voice of a professional who is looking at something his training didn't prepare him for, and is choosing his words very carefully. I didn't have an answer. Nothing in our emergency response manual covers duplicate aircraft. Roberts made the call that probably prevented a disaster. He declared a runway emergency, activated ground stop protocols, diverted all other traffic to alternate airports, and positioned the emergency vehicles at both ends of runway 27 left. But he didn't deny landing clearance, because whatever was approaching had 138 people on board. And his job, above everything else, was to get them safely on the ground. Transcon 447, cleared to land runway 27 left. Be advised, emergency equipment is standing by as a precaution. Cleared to land 27 left, Transcon 447. Thank you for the escort. Captain Chen's voice, identical to the recording from the first landing. Same cadence, same professional tone, same slight Chicago accent. At 7:41:33 p.m., the second Trans-Continental Flight 447 touched down on runway 27 left. Perfect centerline landing. Normal rollout. The aircraft taxied clear of the active runway and stopped on taxiway Alpha, where it was immediately surrounded by emergency vehicles. Roberts stood at the tower window and looked at both aircraft simultaneously. The first at Gate 12, dark, connected to the terminal, maintenance crews moving around its landing gear. The second on taxiway Alpha, engines still running, navigation lights blinking in the dark, surrounded by flashing red and white from the emergency response perimeter. 2 aircraft. Same registration numbers visible on both fuselages. Same airline livery. Same physical configuration down to a dent on the forward cargo door the ground crews had photographed during the first aircraft's arrival inspection. Same dent. 2 aircraft, 1 dent. Roberts described it to me afterward as looking at a photograph of something while the thing itself was standing next to you. I've been trying to find a better description for the last 2 hours. I haven't found one. When Roberts called Civil Defense Emergency Coordination, his voice had changed. Flatter, more precise. The voice of someone who has moved past panic into a place where everything becomes very quiet and very careful. "Marsh," he said, "I need federal response. I need it now. I'm looking at 2 aircraft with the same tail number. and I can't explain what I'm seeing to anyone who wasn't here to see it. Both aircraft are still exactly where they were when this call began. Neither has moved. When Robert's call came in, I ran standard protocol. Aircraft emergency, possible security threat, full activation. FBI field office, regional TSA, airport authority, all notified simultaneously within 4 minutes. The response was fast and professional. 12 minutes later, we had a command post established in the Airport Operations Center. FBI Special Agent Martinez took operational control. Airport Authority Manager Williams coordinated ground response. I maintained communications and documentation. First priority, the aircraft on Taxiway Alpha, which we were now calling 447-Beta. 447-Beta had not responded to ground control since landing. Tower attempts to raise the crew on standard frequencies failed. Emergency frequencies failed. The aircraft sat silent, engines running, surrounded by our perimeter. Through binoculars, ground personnel could see figures moving inside the cabin. Normal passenger behavior, people standing, retrieving overhead luggage, the ordinary restlessness of travelers who have just arrived somewhere. But the door remained closed. Martinez authorized a cautious approach. Operations vehicles moved to within 50 meters. The aircraft looked completely normal. No damage, no signs of distress. Just a plane that shouldn't exist, sitting on a taxiway full of people who didn't know they were impossible. Meanwhile, we had a secondary problem. The passengers from 447-Alpha, the first flight, had dispersed. Some were still in the terminal. Others had already left the facility. We initiated a recall under the cover of additional security screen. 96 passengers returned voluntarily. 42 had already left, unreachable. This was our first major protocol failure. Our emergency response procedures assume a single aircraft, a single manifest, a single set of variables. We had no framework for duplicate events, no checklist, no precedent. Martinez made the decision to board 447-Beta at 8:23 p.m. The boarding team, 3 federal agents, 1 airport security supervisor, 1 medical technician. They approached using a mobile stairway positioned at the forward door. The door opened when they knocked. I'm going to tell you exactly what they found because their report is now part of the official record, and because you need to understand what we're actually dealing with here. The aircraft was full. 138 passengers, seated in the exact configuration shown on the original manifest. All calm, all apparently healthy, all completely convinced they had just landed from a normal flight from Chicago. But none of them were the same people who had deplaned from 447-Alpha 2 hours earlier. Not one face matched. When questioned, each passenger provided identification that matched the original manifest exactly. Same names, same addresses, same government ID numbers. The woman in seat 12A was Margaret Torres, age 43, from Chicago. The Margaret Torres from 447-Alpha was currently in our holding area with an identical license. 2 completely different women, 1 legal identity, both equally documented, equally real, equally impossible. Agent Martinez's boarding team spent 18 minutes inside 447-Beta. When they came back out, Martinez requested immediate psychological support personnel before he said another word to anyone. Here's what they found. 138 passengers, seated in their assigned seats according to the manifest. But when the team compared faces to the passenger photos from 447-Alpha's documentation, there were 0 matches. Not similar faces, not family resemblances, entirely different people. Yet when questioned, each passenger provided names and identification that matched the original manifest exactly. Same names, same addresses, same government ID numbers. Margaret Torres in seat 12A showed a driver's license, identifying her as Margaret Torres, age 43, from Chicago. The Margaret Torres from 447-Alpha, currently sitting in our holding area, had an identical license. Two completely different women, one legal identity, both equally real. The boarding team asked the passengers about their flight. They were responsive, coherent, and increasingly confused by the questions. They insisted they had just landed from Chicago. They produced boarding passes with today's date and the correct flight number. Their carry-on luggage matched their stated travel purposes. But they had no awareness of any time gap. According to their personal devices, phones, watches, tablets, the flight had taken the standard 2 hours and 15 minutes. According to our timeline, they had been in the air for over 3 hours, during which time the first 447 had already landed, deplaned, and been secured for maintenance. Captain Chen, the second Captain Chen, was cooperative but growing visibly agitated. She insisted her flight was on schedule. She needed to complete her post-flight checklist. She needed to release her passengers to the terminal. When told there was already an aircraft at gate 12 with her registration, she went quiet for a long moment. Then she asked to see it. That request was denied. The medical technician found all passengers in good physical health, normal vital signs, no signs of trauma or medical emergency. But there was one consistent anomaly across every single person interviewed: mild temporal disorientation, difficulty with short-term memory formation, confusion about elapsed time. Several passengers reported feeling unstuck, their word used independently by at least 9 different people without prompting. Unstuck. The medical technician's preliminary assessment used a phrase I had never encountered in any emergency protocol: consistent with exposure to a localized temporal distortion field. Martinez read the assessment, looked up at me, and said, "What does that mean?" I told him I didn't know. But somewhere between the duplicate aircraft and the duplicate passengers and the word unstuck, appearing 9 times in independent interviews, I had started to understand that we were not dealing with a security threat or an aviation anomaly. We were dealing with something that had no category in our systems. At 8:47 p.m., both aircraft remain on the ground. Both sets of passengers exist simultaneously. Both are equally real, equally documented, equally impossible. And I'm beginning to suspect this is just the beginning. At 9:03 p.m., this situation was elevated above FBI jurisdiction. The call came directly to my console, not through normal channels, a direct line from someone who identified himself only as Director Hayes, Temporal Studies Division. I had never heard of Temporal Studies Division. Hayes told me specialized personnel were being deployed. ETA 90 minutes. Until their arrival, all information regarding Flight 447 was classified under national security protocols. Full media blackout. Nothing released to the public. I asked Hayes what Temporal Studies Division was. His response? "We handle situations like this when they occur." Which they do occur, Coordinator Marsh. More often than you might think. That sentence landed in my chest like something physical. More often than you might think. Hayes gave me specific instructions. Both aircraft were to remain isolated. No passenger contact between the two groups under any circumstances. No physical interaction between any duplicate individuals. All personnel were to be logged and monitored for what he called temporal displacement symptoms. I asked what those symptoms were. Memory inconsistencies, difficulty maintaining linear time perception, in severe cases awareness of multiple timeline branches simultaneously. He paused. "If you start remembering conversations we haven't had yet, notify the incoming team immediately." The specialized team arrived at 10:34 p.m. 3 people in unmarked vehicles. No names, just designations. lead, technical, and medical. They established a separate command post and began their own assessment without briefing us on their methodology. Lead spoke with Martinez privately for 23 minutes. When they emerged, Martinez looked like a man who had been told something he was not going to be able to forget. He pulled me aside and said, "This is beyond us now. We're support only." Technical began installing equipment around both aircraft. Devices I didn't recognize. Sensors that hummed at frequencies that made the fillings in my back teeth ache. When I asked what they were measuring, Technical said, "Temporal coherence, the structural integrity of local space-time." I stood there for a moment, processing that sentence. Then I went back to my console because there was nothing else to do. Medical began interviewing passengers from both groups. The questions were unusual, not standard security debriefing. Questions about time perception, memory formation, whether they felt complete or partial. Several passengers from both groups answered that last question the same way. Partial. At 11:17 p.m., Technical reported their initial findings to Lead in a conversation I wasn't supposed to overhear. Our operations center is small. Temporal bifurcation, classic split timeline scenario. Something caused the flight to divide into two probability branches at approximately 7:15 p.m. Both branches are equally valid. Both are trying to exist in the same space-time coordinates. Lead asked, "Cause?" Technical, "Unknown. But the split is widening. If we don't stabilize this soon, we could see additional branches." I wrote that down. The split is widening. At 1:07 a.m., we uncovered a pattern that turned this from an aviation anomaly into something far more disturbing. Using passenger manifests, emergency contact information, and law enforcement databases, we began checking on the original versions of the 447 passengers, the people who should have been on that flight in our timeline. What we found was a pattern of disappearances that stretched back 3 days. Margaret Torres, the woman whose duplicate was in our holding area, had been reported missing by her husband on Monday morning. She had left for a business trip to Chicago, but never arrived at her hotel. Her rental car was found abandoned at O'Hare International Airport. David Kim had missed an important meeting on Tuesday. His colleagues assumed he was sick, but he hadn't called in. His apartment was empty, his car in the parking garage, no indication of where he had gone. 17 more passengers showed the same pattern. Missing persons reports filed by family members, unexplained absences from work and obligations, people who had simply vanished from their normal lives in the days leading up to Flight 447. But here is what made it truly terrifying. The missing persons reports described people who were subtly different from the passengers in our holding areas. Margaret Torres's husband described her as having a small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident. The Margaret Torres from 447-Alpha had no such scar. David Kim's colleagues described him as left-handed. The David Kim from 447-Beta was clearly right-handed. Small differences, but consistent. Every passenger we could verify showed minor variations from their missing counterparts. Lead assembled all available personnel for an emergency briefing at 1:34 a.m. "We're dealing with a timeline displacement event," Lead explained. "Approximately 72 hours ago, people from our timeline began disappearing. They were replaced by near-identical versions from an alternate probability branch. Those alternates then boarded Flight 447 in Chicago, creating a temporal paradox when they attempted to travel to a destination where their counterparts had already disappeared." Agent Martinez asked the question everyone in the room needed answered. "Where are our people? The original versions?" Lead's response was devastating in its quietness. "Most likely They're in the alternate timeline, experiencing the same displacement in reverse. Their versions of us are probably dealing with missing persons reports and impossible aircraft right now. I thought about that for a moment. Another version of me, at another console, in another timeline that was almost identical to this one, trying to process the same impossible situation. I asked, can we send them back, return the alternates to their timeline, and get our people back? Lead and Technical exchanged a look I had already learned to dread. Technical answered, theoretically possible, but it requires deliberately destabilizing the timeline fracture, creating a controlled collapse that sends each group back to their origin point. Martinez asked the obvious follow-up, and if it doesn't work? Lead said, if it doesn't work, we lose both timelines. Everyone involved ceases to exist across all probability branches. The room was completely silent. Nearly 300 people. 2 realities. One procedure that had never been attempted under these exact conditions. And less than 4 hours until dawn, when the airport would return to normal operations, and this situation would become impossible to contain. At 11:42 p.m., Technical's warning about the widening split proved accurate in the worst possible way. Regional Tower picked up a third radar contact. Same flight number, same approach path, same impossible situation. Except now we had 3 versions of Trans-Continental 447 converging on the same runway. Robert's voice on the radio was the flattest I've ever heard it. Not panicked. Past panicked. Arrived at a place on the other side of panic where everything becomes very quiet and very precise. Marsh, third contact, same registration, descending through 10,000, what do I do? It wasn't a question. It was a man telling me the world had stopped making sense and asking me to confirm it. Lead made the decision to deny landing clearance to 447-Gamma. But the aircraft didn't respond to tower instructions. It continued its approach, descending through controlled airspace on a collision course with the runway where 447-Beta was still parked. Roberts broadcast emergency warnings on all frequencies. The third aircraft acknowledged the warnings and did not alter course. Regional Tower, Transcon 447 requesting immediate landing. We have a medical emergency on board. Captain Chen's voice again. But different this time. The professional calm was gone. There was something underneath it, a fraying quality, like a rope with too many fibers already snapped. Technical was monitoring from the operations center. The timeline fracture is accelerating. Each new branch is more unstable than the last. This one is showing signs of causal degradation. Events inside that aircraft are happening out of sequence. Roberts gave landing clearance because 138 people were on board and there was no other choice. 447-Gamma touched down on the parallel runway at 11:47 p.m. The landing was rough. The aircraft wove slightly on rollout, corrected, wove again. It came to a stop at the far end of the runway and immediately began taxiing toward the terminal at unsafe speed. Ground control ordered it to stop. It didn't stop. Technical grabbed their radio. All personnel clear the area. Do not allow physical contact between any of the aircraft. Maintain separation at all costs. But the geometry of the taxiway didn't allow it. 447-Gamma was moving too fast, the angle was wrong, and by the time the ground crew vehicles repositioned themselves, the wingtip of 447-Gamma had made contact with the tail section of 447-Alpha at gate 12. The impact was minor, a scrape. Under normal circumstances, a paperwork incident. The air around the contact point shimmered. Not heat waves, something different. A visible distortion, like the air itself was having difficulty deciding what shape to hold. It rippled outward from the two aircraft in a slow, silent wave. Every piece of electronic equipment in the terminal flickered. The lights dropped for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, I saw a fourth aircraft. Translucent, incomplete. The outline of a plane that was trying to materialize in the same space as the other two. Then the distortion collapsed. 447 Gamma was gone. Not destroyed, not moved, gone. As if it had never been there, except for a shallow gouge in 447, Alpha's tail section, and the memory of every person who had watched it vanish. Technical's voice was very quiet. Timeline collapse. The system couldn't support 3 concurrent branches. It defaulted to the 2 most stable versions. I asked about the passengers. Technical didn't answer immediately. That pause told me everything. 138 people had just ceased to exist. At 2:18 a.m. we received a transmission that broke whatever remained of my understanding of the world. It came through the emergency frequency, but not from any of our aircraft. The signal was weak, distorted, cycling in and out of clarity like a shortwave broadcast from very far away. But the voice was unmistakably human. Regional Airport Authority, this is Coordinator David Marsh, Civil Defense Emergency Network. If anyone can hear this, please respond. My own voice, coming through the radio, calling for help. I grabbed the handset with shaking fingers. This is Coordinator Marsh at Regional Airport Authority. Identify yourself. Static, then. This is going to sound insane. This is David Marsh. I don't know how to explain this. From the other side of what happened to your Flight 447. The voice was mine, but strained, exhausted, speaking with the cadence of someone who had been awake for days. We've been dealing with missing persons reports for 3 days, the other me continued. People disappearing from their normal lives. Then tonight, we had an aircraft land that shouldn't exist. Trans-Continental 447. But our version never took off. Our passengers never boarded. They've been missing since Saturday. Lead took a second handset. Federal Authority, identify your timeline designation. I don't have a timeline designation. I'm just a civil defense coordinator trying to find out what happened to our people. Technical was adjusting equipment, trying to strengthen the signal. They confirmed cross-dimensional communication and then said nothing else, which told me the situation was beyond even their prepared responses. The other me continued. Our technical team says there was a temporal fracture. They think our people were pulled into your reality and replaced by yours. Is that what you're seeing? I pressed the transmit button. Affirmative. We have your people. They arrived on 2 aircrafts, different versions of the same flight. Our people have been missing for 3 days. 2 aircraft? The other me sounded confused. We only show 1 landing here, but our instruments are reading massive temporal instability on your end. Our technical team says your timeline is fracturing. Technical leaned in. Confirm your timeline stability. Stable as far as we can tell, but we're seeing echoes. Our people sometimes remember things that didn't happen here. Events from your timeline, maybe. Lead took control. We're going to attempt a controlled restoration, both timelines simultaneously. We need coordination from your end. What do you need? Prepare your people for reintegration. When we collapse the fracture, your people should return to your timeline simultaneously. There may be memory bleed, fragments of the alternate timeline retained afterwards. A long pause from the other side. Then the other me said, Our families just want them back, whatever condition they're in. Understood, Lead said. We initiate at 4 a.m. Monitor this frequency. Wait. His voice dropped. What if it fails? What if we lose everyone? Blood answered honestly. Then both timelines collapse, and this conversation never happened. The signal faded to static. We had 102 minutes to save two realities. At 2:45 a.m., Technical began building what they called a temporal restoration field. Equipment I couldn't identify was positioned around both aircraft with precise, methodical care. The air between the planes took on a faint shimmer, the same distortion we had seen during the collision, but controlled, contained within specific boundaries. The principle is straightforward, Technical explained, not really talking to me so much as organizing their own thinking aloud. We destabilize the timeline fracture in a controlled manner. Instead of random collapse, we guide it back to the original split point and reverse the process. Each group returns to their origin timeline. Medical was preparing both passenger groups. They explained the situation as clearly and calmly as possible. The passengers were from an alternate timeline. They would be returning to their own reality. They might retain memories from their time and ours. The reactions were devastating. Margaret Torres from 447 Alpha sat with her hands flat on her knees and told Medical she didn't want to go back to a timeline where she was divorced and living alone. She had spent hours looking through the window at her counterpart, the other Margaret, the one from 447-Beta, who had a husband and children, and she couldn't decide which of them was the real one. David Kim from 447-Beta said nothing during the preparation briefing. He sat by himself near the window of holding area D and looked at the tarmac where both aircraft were being repositioned. In his timeline, his wife was dead. In ours, she was alive somewhere, living a life that had nothing to do with him. He was about to be sent back to a reality where she was gone, carrying the memory of a world where she wasn't. Medical approached him. "I know this is difficult," she said quietly, "but you'll be going home. To your real life." Kim looked up at her with eyes that held too much weight. "In my real life, she's been dead for 2 years. Here, I remember her laugh. I remember her making coffee this morning. Which one feels more real to you?" Medical didn't have an answer for that. Neither did I. At 3:47 a.m., both aircraft were repositioned to their exact original coordinates. Technical used instruments that measured space-time position to microscopic precision, cross-referencing with the GPS data from the original landing timestamps. At 3:52 a.m., we reestablished contact with the alternate timeline. The other me confirmed readiness on their end. His voice was calmer than it had been earlier, the calm of someone who has made peace with the outcome because the outcome is no longer in their control. "Marsh," he said through the static, "if this works, we both get our people back. If it doesn't, neither of us will remember it not working," I finished. "Yeah," a pause. "See you on the other side." "See you on the other side." At 3:58 a.m., Technical initiated the restoration sequence. The air around both aircraft began to glow with a soft blue-white light. The shimmer effect intensified until both planes appeared to be underwater, distorted and wavering. Inside the aircraft, passengers reported feeling unstuck from time. Some said they could see both timelines simultaneously, their lives and our reality overlapping with memories of their original timeline. At 3:59 a.m., the temporal fracture began to destabilize. At exactly 4 a.m., both aircraft began to fade. What happened next defied every law of physics I thought I understood. Both aircraft didn't disappear gradually. They flickered, like old film reels skipping frames between solid and translucent. For brief moments I could see through them to the tarmac beyond. Then they would snap back into sharp focus, more real than anything else in my field of vision. Technical was reading instruments that had never been designed for a situation like this. Timeline convergence at 60%, 70, 80. Inside the aircraft, the passengers were experiencing what medical would later describe as temporal vertigo. They were living multiple moments simultaneously. Departure from Chicago, approach to regional, time in the holding areas, and the return to their original timeline, all happening at once in their perception. I could hear them through the open aircraft doors, not screaming, not panicking, making sounds that were harder to listen to than either of those things would have been. The sounds of people trying to speak while experiencing everything at once. At 4:02 a.m., the alternate timeline made contact. My own voice overlapping with echoes, as if multiple versions of the same person were speaking in unison from slightly different positions in space. We can see them, our people. They're materializing here, but they look changed, like they're carrying something. Technical. Expected. Memory bleed is normal during restoration. It stabilizes within 72 hours. I looked at the fading aircraft. The passengers inside were becoming translucent, their outlines wavering. I found myself remembering events that hadn't happened. Conversations with people I had never met. A version of my life where I had made different choices, lived somewhere else, become someone slightly different. The memories weren't replacing my real ones. They were layering over them. A second transparency placed over the first, both visible at once. At 4:04 a.m., technical. 95%. Final phase. The aircraft were barely visible now. Suggestions of aircraft. The idea of aircraft. But I could still hear the passengers inside. Margaret Torres's voice, faint and clear at the same time. The way sounds are in certain kinds of dreams. Tell my husband in this timeline that I'm sorry. Tell him the other me would have loved him too. David Kim, quieter. Remember us, please. Don't let this timeline forget we were here. At 4:06 a.m., both aircraft vanished completely. The tarmac was empty. The gates were clear. The shimmer in the air was gone. The instruments read baseline normal. According to every system we had, Trans-Continental Flight 447 had never existed. Robert's voice came over the radio from the tower, very quiet. Marsh, they're gone. I know. Both of them. I know. A long silence on the frequency. Then Robert said, "What do we do now?" I looked at the empty tarmac for a long time before I answered. We filed the report. We go back to normal operations. We don't talk about this. And the passengers, the real ones? They'll go home, I said. They won't remember being missing. They'll think they landed on schedule. Another silence. Marsh, do we remember? I looked at the empty gate. Gate 12. Dark, silent, connected to nothing. Yeah, I said. We remember. The alternate timeline made one final contact. We have our people back. Thank you. And take care of the memories. They're all we have left of each other. Then the frequency went silent. It was over. It has been 24 hours since the restoration. I filed the official incident report this morning. Minor radar anomaly resolved. No aircraft involved. No passengers affected. Normal operations resumed at 04:07. 14 words to cover 6 hours of the most impossible thing I have ever witnessed. The passengers from our original timeline began returning over the course of the day. They appeared in their homes, at their jobs, in their normal lives, with no memory of having been missing. To them, no time had passed. They had boarded Flight 447 in Chicago and landed at Regional Airport exactly as scheduled. But there are subtle changes. Margaret Torres returned to her husband, but she is different, more affectionate, more present, as if she had gained a deeper appreciation for their marriage. When her husband mentioned this, she said she had been having dreams about being divorced, about living alone, and the dreams made her grateful for what she had. David Kim returned to his job, but his colleagues noticed he seemed to be grieving something. He would occasionally mention his wife in present tense, as if she were still alive, then catch himself and look confused. These weren't just recovered memories. They were carrying pieces of the alternate timeline back with them, fragments of lives they had lived in another reality. By 6 p.m., the airport had returned to full normal operations. The day shift had come and gone. Ground crews, gate agents, baggage handlers moved through the space where two impossible aircraft had stood, where people from another timeline had pressed their hands against glass and looked at alternate versions of their own lives, where the air had shimmered with the structural stress of two realities trying to occupy the same coordinates. They moved through it like it was just another Wednesday evening. Roberts came down from the tower at the end of his shift. He poured himself coffee from the operations center machine and sat across from me without saying anything for a full 3 minutes. Then, "You sleep at all?" "No." "Me neither." He looked at his coffee. "The passengers, the real ones, they just went home?" "According to the restoration protocol, yes. They returned to their timeline with no memory of the displacement. So Margaret Torres woke up this morning in her own bed. No idea she was gone for 3 days. That's the theory." Roberts was quiet for a moment. "And the alternates? The ones we talked to? The ones who were in the holding areas? Back in their timeline? Carrying memories of being here?" "Yes." He nodded slowly. "David Kim, the one whose wife is dead in his timeline. He went back knowing she's alive somewhere, just not in his reality." I didn't have a response to that. There wasn't one. Roberts finished his coffee, stood up, and said, "I'm going back to the tower, and we've got a 6:45 arrival from Atlanta." He walked out. I stayed at the console. The 6:45 from Atlanta came in clean. Normal approach, normal landing, normal taxi to the gate. I watched it on the monitors and felt nothing but relief at how utterly ordinary it was. At 6:15 p.m., I started my end-of-shift documentation. Routine entries, nothing to report. At 6:19 p.m., the evening was quiet, weather clear, light crosswind from the northwest. At 6:21 p.m., Roberts called down from the tower. His voice had the same quality it had 24 hours ago. Marsh, I've got a contact descending through 8,000 on runway 27 left approach, squawking Trans-Continental 447, Chicago to Regional. 138 souls on board." My blood turned to ice water. I looked at the arrival board. Trans-Continental 447 was not scheduled to arrive tonight. Trans-Continental had quietly retired the flight number 3 weeks ago after the incident. I had seen the notice in the aviation bulletins. I looked at the tarmac cameras. Gate 12 was empty. I looked at the temporal monitoring equipment that Technical had left behind. The readings were spiking. "Roberts," I said, my voice steadier than my hands, "confirm aircraft registration." A pause, then. "November 747 Mike Charlie." The same tail number, the same registration, that had appeared twice 24 hours ago, that had caused a fracture in reality itself, that had brought us face to face with the impossible. My hand was already reaching for the federal contact number when Robert's voice came through again. "Marsh, it's on final. What do I do?" "Oh," I looked at the empty space where 2 aircraft had materialized yesterday, where passengers from another timeline had looked through glass at alternate versions of themselves, where the air had shimmered with the weight of colliding realities. The same space, the same flight, the same time. 6:23 p.m. I thought about Leeds' warning that these events tend to cluster, that once a fracture occurs, the scar tissue makes future fractures more likely. I thought about Technical saying the split was widening. I thought about David Kim carrying memories of a world where his wife was still alive, and Margaret Torres dreaming of a life she'd never lived, and 42 passengers who had left the airport before we could account for them, who might not have been from our timeline at all. I thought about the universe developing a stutter, and how some stutters become permanent conditions. Give them clearance, I said, because 138 people were on board, and there was no other choice. Cleared to land 27 left, Roberts transmitted, his voice hollow. Cleared to land 27 left, Trans-Con 447. Thank you for the escort. Captain Chen's voice. Calm, professional, routine. Exactly like yesterday. Exactly like it had been the first time. I leaned into the microphone and began broadcasting on the emergency frequency. This is WLLR-AM 9913, Civil Defense Emergency Broadcast Network. If you are just tuning in, stay tuned. On the radar screen, the blip that was Trans-Continental Flight 447 continued its descent toward runway 27 left. Because apparently, I said, not bothering to hide the exhaustion in my voice, Flight 447 has decided it wasn't done landing twice. At 6:23 p.m., Trans-Continental Flight 447 touched down at Regional Airport. Again. I reached for the federal contact number with one hand and started a new page in the logbook with the other. Outside, the universe prepared to stutter once more. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like falling, that this was never going to end. That somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility, Flight 447 was always landing, always arriving, always carrying 138 souls who belonged somewhere else. That reality had developed a crack, and we were living in the echo. The time is 6:24 p.m. Flight 447 is taxiing to the gate, and I'm beginning to understand that some fractures never heal. They just keep breaking.